Hey folks, so this is your first video on section 2.1. What I'd like for you to do is go down to where it talks about the library of functions. You're going to have 6 different functions that you need to be aware of. We'll come back and fill in a few things during class, but I want to get the basic ideas down for each one of these. So the first parent function, and I'm going to constantly be calling them the parent functions, is going to be the identity function. And that's going to be y equals x, or f of x equals x. So if you were to set up a junior high xy chart and you were to plug in over here on the left a -1, then plugging in a -1 for x gives you a -1 for y. Plugging in a 0 for x gives you a 0 for y. Plugging in a 1 for x gives you a 1 for y. So you would have then the coordinate 0, 0, the coordinate 1, 1, and the coordinate -1, -1. And what this is going to draw for us is going to be a line. And this line cuts quadrant 1 and 3 exactly in half. Now in class time we'll come back and we'll talk about domain and range, but really you should be able to get those on your own according to what we've already learned about domain and range. The second parent is going to be the squaring function. The squaring function is f of x is equal to x squared. And so again, if you do a small xy chart and you plug in a -1, a -1 squared, or a -1 times a -1 is going to be a +1. A 0 times a 0 is a 0, and a 1 squared is 1. So we have here the coordinate -1, 1, the coordinate 0, 0, and the coordinate 1, 1. Now, I'd also like for you to look at a little bit more of this, because what we'll be doing is, yes, we're going to go to the right one and to the left one, but we're also going to go to the right 2 and to the left 2 on these, so that you know if you were to look at an x value of 2 or an x value of -2, these are both going to give you y values of 4. So we'll draw those as well. So to the right 2 up 4, and to the left 2 up 4. And this is going to produce for us what we call the parabola. Later in chapter 3, we'll talk about it as the quadratic. And we have the square root function, so this is going to be the square root of x, the square root of x. Well, first of all, the square root of any negative number is imaginary, so on this one there is no y value, so I can't draw anything on that one. But if I take the square root of 0, I get 0. If I take the square root of 1, I get 1. Now, I don't know what the square root of 2 is, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the one that I do know, and the next one that I know about is the square root of 4, and the square root of 4 is 2. So I'm going to go ahead and count down to 4, so I need to extend my axis just a tad, and the square root of 4 is 2. To me, this kind of looks like a piece of the parabola that's tipped over on its side, but the bottom half is not there. All right, the fourth parent that we're going to talk about is the cubing parent. So this is going to be y is equal to x cubed. So if I take a -1 cubed, -1 times -1 times -1, that gives me a -1. A 0 cubed is 0. A 1 cubed is 1. And you might think that this is identical to the identity function, but it isn't. If you think about a 2 cubed, and I'm not going to draw this, but a 2 cubed is all the way up at 8, and I don't want to count up 8 blocks. So what this happens to be, the right side looks like a parabola, only it is skinnier than the parabola. And the left side looks as though the parabola broke and is down below the x-axis. That's the cubing function. Then we have the cubed root function. The cubed root function uses the square root symbol, but there's a little 3 inside of here. So this is the cubed root function. The cubed root of -1, literally what I'm asking is what number multiplied by itself 3 times gives you -1, and that's going to be a -1. The cubed root of 0 is 0, and the cubed root of +1 is 1. And again, this is looking very similar to the last question, the last parent. The next pretty cubed root is not until the cubed root of 8, and I don't have 8 blocks to run, but if I were to draw the cubed root of 8, I would get 2. So this looks a little bit similar to the square root parent, only it's much shorter. And not only that, I do have something below the x-axis, and I didn't have that on the square root parent. Last parent is the absolute value function. So this is going to be, you remember the absolute value bars, the absolute value of x. We know that the absolute value of 0 is 0. The absolute value of 1 is 1. So those two coordinates have been on every parent so far. Lastly, the absolute value of -1, remember, is +1. This looks like the parabola started, but think with me about a couple of other values. The absolute value of -2 is +2. The absolute value of +2 is +2. And so this is not as nice and curvy as the parabola graph is. This is going to be called the V-graph, because it looks like a V. When we come to class, we're going to talk about the domain and range. I would suggest that you try to come up with the domain and the range on your own, since we've already learned that in the last section of the notes.